what, when, and how that actually dictated release patterns. And so these are things you have to be willing to, I think, plunge into as a student of media industries or a scholar. And, you know, off of Nitin's point, where do we draw boundaries and how do we define an industry? For me, I think one of the most fascinating things is also how do we define markets and where do we draw boundaries around markets right now? So, which has to do a lot with, you know, policy and how markets are defined, and looking at case law, and looking at how judges have adjudicated the matters of markets and how policy is defining markets, because right now the way that markets are defined is so completely divorced from the actual technological potential and possibility and capabilities that we have. So the language of and the philosophical foundation of policy is divorced from the realities of the marketplace. So I think that's a really fascinating topic right now. And then, of course, there's the crisis in business models, right? How do we, which is kind of 101, what's going on right now? How do we find a way to monetize this exodus to the digital space, which is kind of what everybody is thinking about at this moment. And what does that mean for labor, right? I think something like 75% of pilots were not shot in LA this past season. So the crisis in business models has a ripple effect to all different arenas of industry study, and I think that's pretty much what everybody in the business is focused on at the moment.
Well, they may have shot all those pilots out of LA, but they did move all my children to Los Angeles from New York. So there is hope for stable employment in the media industries.
So I have 4 themes that I think are important. The first is political theory, and specifically the state of democracy and how screen culture relates to that. For maybe a third of its life, Hollywood, as you know, was not protected by the First Amendment because the Supreme Court did not consider that film was speech. But what that also means, between 1915 and 1952, I guess it was, is that it is assumed that dramatic representation is not part of democracy. And that's, I think, something well worth talking about, because, apart from anything else, apart from all the issues about representational politics of social identities, subjectivities, and so on, it also relates to a very important political economic question, which is the way in which you connect diversity to democracy, specifically diversity of outlets. I remember having a fight with someone from the Justice Department under Clinton who said, well, we used to think that the number of major media owners you needed to have in order to ensure diversity of textuality, as we might say, was 9. Now we know it's 6. I said, well, how did you define that? And it was through an algorithm, essentially. But it seems to me that a crucial issue on this political theory, diversity and democracy front is to try to move the debate away from just talking about how many owners there are. You know, oh, sorry, Jennifer. The fact that when you look at when Ben Bagdikian first did his Media Monopolies book, there were 52 and now there are 5, and saying, that's terrible, or saying, it doesn't matter because we're in a cybertarian universe of plenty, and so there are so many plugs, ownership is irrelevant. And instead saying, if you claim either that ownership is super relevant, or you claim it's not relevant, either based on the idea of a certain number of owners or on the idea of a certain number of outlets that expand the capacity of people to become producers, then we need instead to shift the argument and say, let's look at the outcomes. How much more knowledgeable is the US public about the imperialist foreign policy of its country than was the case 50 years ago? How much more knowledgeable was the US public, thanks to the internet, in the run-up to the Iraq War than it was when it got its knowledge from daily newspapers that were well-funded? That, in fact, one needs to do textual analysis, content analysis, and ethnographic audience analysis to establish the impact of media ownership patterns on diversity and democracy, and not the number of media owners. It's a question with only one. Second issue is environmentalism. The whole of media historiography has to be rewritten, starting from the moment when vellum is the dominant source of creating books or documents, right through to the emergence of paper, to the role of people like rag pickers, who were the people who collected disused clothing and made that into what became the beginnings of European-style parchment, and of course are still crucially important when it comes to putting together old, rejected, disposed of cell phones, televisions, computers, and so on for recycling and reuse, and seeing the way in which a place like Rochester, New York, anybody in the audience from Rochester, New York? You know, for the last 35 years, it's been the most polluted city in New York State. Guess why? Because of the beloved film industry and what that's done to its water system. Hundreds of thousands of times higher in pollution levels than the EPA can find virtually anywhere else, including in some of the heavy industry areas of the world. Take a look at Google. Outside the US military, possibly one of the greatest users of electricity in the world. Right?
Yeah.
Why is Google looking at moving all its server farms to Iceland? It's not very hot there. Right? Why is it thought that Google and Microsoft have so much of their facility very close to power stations? Because you don't pay very much for the power to go a certain distance. What is the carbon footprint of Fox in a given year? 650,000 tons. What does it mean that 24 is the first primetime television program on a network that is carbon neutral, at the same time as it is, without a doubt, a pay-in to appalling white male vigilantism and terrorism, right? That it's produced by people who call themselves right-wing nut jobs. So the environmental questions have to be at the core of a comprehensive rewriting of media historiography. The third issue that has to be addressed, which has already been mentioned by my colleagues here, is labour, because the precariat is the group that is now, in a sense, dominant numerically, if not in power terms, in the way in which the media industries work. People who often come from middle-class backgrounds, whose parents, in the US sense, had health insurance, had education, had political entree and so on, and who themselves have education, had political entree, maybe had health care, are now not going to be getting, or are not getting, those things within the sectors where they're working, lack any sense of continuity of employment. This isn't just happening here, it's happening throughout Western Europe, it's happening in Japan, and in some ways you could say this is when post-Fordism really kicks in. And that relates also to people who are the ultimate precariat, people in this informal sector of whom Nitin spoke, sometimes called rag pickers. There are plenty of other names for them. There are millions of them around the world, lots of them in the Americas. They're dealing with the television sets that you throw out, the computers that you throw out, the cell phones you get rid of. So what's happening with them in labour terms? And then the last thing is we need to get rid of film schools like this one. They have to be closed down because they're guilty of falsehood in advertising. They are wastes of resources, and they are anachronistic in terms of their aesthetic and their notion of what counts as knowledge.
There might be an argument for closing down all graduate schools.
What do you want instead of this? What do you think there should be instead of this?
I knew people would focus on that one and none of the other
Yeah.
things, which is so much more important. I think that we need to be straightforward and honest about where universities in the United States function and what they do. So it seems to me that something like the Institute for Creative Technology, is anybody here involved with that? Right, it's part of USC. It's gotten, I think, $80 million in set-up money from DARPA, which is the Pentagon. It makes toys that are used in Hollywood movies, that are used on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan. It involves faculty from this school, from the Annenberg School, from engineering, from other parts of the university. And it has comparators right across the United States, in Florida, in Pittsburgh. They're the two main other places. It does a lot of the special effects for Spider-Man. It was designed physically by the guy who was the designer for Star Trek. It brings together homicidal technologists in Hollywood, in USC, and in the Pentagon. And for our delectation as consumers, our protection as citizens, if we're citizens, and the destruction and despoliation of people and other forms of life around the world as required. Well, it seems to me that that world of creative technologies is actually, in its absolute complicitness with the role of the state, the role of capital, and the role of education, a much easier target and a much more significant place and a much more honest and open environment in lots of ways. You can go on a tour, if you so wish, than the film school world, which pretends that film is what people make when it's not. Film is what people watch when it's not. That pretends to the people who are going there to become filmmakers, A, that they will make film, and B, that in terms of both the physicality of that medium, the presumed length and story format of that old medium, that will be what they do. When they will go and work in the valley making porn, or they will make short-form television as the precariat.
Okay, well that leads me to my next question. What do you think about the distinction between film and television as it matters in the academy and in the industries, and music for that matter? I mean, what would be the kind of questions you would encourage people to ask, as well as kind of models of looking at that? Jen, I know you have an answer to this. So.
Well, as far as studying it, or as
well, or as it operates,
Yeah, I mean, I'm always begging my students who think they're going to make film to go that. Well, I tell them they're not going to be making films; that they're going to be making TV, and that they need to think about that in a different way. They need to be thinking about what kind of producers they want to be and accept the fact that most likely it's not going to be of feature films, which is what they all think that they're going to be doing. I mean, to me, all of these companies, the 5 or 6 giant companies, they're all just cable companies, right? I mean, feature film is nothing in their revenue pie. Very small, very small. The whole Comcast merger, they didn't even, first of all, they didn't even care if they got NBC in the deal. They probably would have been happier if they didn't. And it was all about NBC's cable properties, right? The most valuable property in that whole deal was USA Network. It's the most profitable business in NBC Universal. So I think when we think about these companies, there is a certain privilege that is usually afforded to the film industry when, if you're going to privilege, financials, and if you're going to privilege economics, which is usually what is one measure, I guess not the only measure, but if that's going to be your measure, then it's all about cable, really. And these companies, what has been propping up the ability for them to even make film has been cable production and the cable business. So I think if we want to even understand how the film industry works, we have to understand how cable works, because without the cable business, they wouldn't be able to make half the films that they do. So I don't really see any difference in studying them in terms of looking at conglomerates. They're all one big mash to me. Of course, there are aesthetic issues, textual issues, different modes of production that matter, different business models, but I don't know. From an economic standpoint, I tend to see a lot of those barriers dissolve.